thanks to Shopify for supporting Future Hindsight. Shopify is a platform designed for anyone to sell anywhere, giving entrepreneurs like myself the resources once reserved for big business. Sign up for a $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/hopeful, all lowercase. And if you want to support Future Hindsight, you can. Join the Civics Club on Patreon for early access to episodes every week. Head to patreon.com/Future Hindsight to sign up. Welcome to Future Hindsight, a podcast on a mission to spark civic action. I'm your host, Mila Atmos. I'm a global citizen based in New York City, and I'm deeply curious about the way our society works. So each week I bring you conversations to cut through the confusion around today's most important civic issues and share clear, actionable ways for us to build a brighter future together. After all, democracy is not a spectator sport. Tomorrow starts right now. Every day, millions of Americans consume what appear to be straightforward news stories about crime, safety, and policing. But what if these stories are actually part of a sophisticated propaganda system that's fundamentally reshaping how we think about justice, safety, and democracy itself? To unpack this question, we're joined by Alec Karakatsanis, founder and executive director of Civil Rights Corps and author of Copaganda: How Police and the Media Manipulate Our News. Alec was last on our show discussing the usual cruelty of the punishment bureaucracy, and today he's back with insights about how media manipulation serves that same system. Alec, welcome back. Thanks for joining us again.
Thank you so much for having me back.
So you were last on the show to talk about the casual cruelty of the punishment bureaucracy. To refresh our listeners' memories, and for those who are new to the podcast, please define the term punishment bureaucracy because we'll be referring to it throughout this conversation. So what is the punishment bureaucracy, and why do you use this term instead of criminal justice?
A lot of people say criminal justice system, but for me, I don't want to convey that either the purpose or the effect of this system is to do justice. Really, what's going on is a massive bureaucracy of punishment. When I use that term, I'm not just talking about all of the police and the prosecutors and the probation and the parole officers and the judges and the prison and jail guards and all of the unions that represent them. I'm also talking about the constellation of multi-billion-dollar industries that are parasitic on every single component of that system. So the people that make and build the jails, the handcuffs, the tasers, the guns, the software programs that do the predictive policing, the artificial intelligence algorithms that do license plate readers and facial recognition, the multi-billion-dollar for-profit commercial money bail industry that exists only in the United States and the Philippines, the multi-billion-dollar prison and jail telecom industry, the prison and jail medical care industry, the commissary that sells all the food and the other supplies inside jails and prisons. There's an endless array of interests who benefit from this bureaucracy constantly expanding and that serves the interests of people in our society that own things and that have a lot of power. And like any bureaucracy, it is designed to serve the interests of the people who wield it. And I think it's very, very important to understand it as a tool of power rather than as some kind of independent, freestanding, beneficent entity that is trying in some way to serve justice or safety. It has never functioned like that throughout its entire history. And that's neither its purpose nor its goal.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thanks for laying this out so thoroughly. And it's really great to start here to ground our conversation. So now, enter your second book. As the executive director of Civil Rights Corps, which challenges systemic injustice in the United States legal system, I'm sure there are many other books you could have written. So I'm curious about why you chose to write this book. And also tell us about the research that you conducted in order to write it, because it's quite thorough and methodical.
I became somewhat obsessed with what stories our society must be telling itself in order to pursue such not only ineffective, but catastrophic policies with respect to safety. So the content of our safety policies is akin to some kind of modern flat earther policy. So we are now putting people in cages and separating them from their families at rates that are about 6 times the steady historical average of this country from the time of its founding to about 1980, and about 5 to 10 times other comparably wealthy countries. And we also have very high levels of harm and violence in our society. So it's not working. So why do we keep investing more and more and more in it? And as I was going around the country as a civil rights lawyer, over the years, I saw in every place I went this extraordinary gap between how the system talks about itself in its constitutional scrolls and marble monuments. You think of the phrase equal justice under law inscribed on the United States Supreme Court. That gap between the words that we use and the daily reality for the most marginalized people in our society who are experiencing extraordinary forms of brutality and violence and injustice and kind of incoherent and irrational and arbitrary policies. And I asked myself, how is the public justifying this to itself? What are the stories the public is telling itself? And I started really monitoring the news. And this is particularly important in the wake of the 2020 uprisings, where there was an unprecedented movement in the streets about the injustices and racial injustices in particular, but more broadly, the injustices and violence of the U.S. policing bureaucracy. And there was a key moment when over half the country in this big national poll even supported the burning down of the Minneapolis police precinct. It's almost unthinkable now when you think about that moment and what it was like. But corporations across society, large corporations, were expressing, solidarity, and police and military gear were holding hands with protesters and kneeling. It was a very strange moment, right? But in the wake of that moment, there was an unprecedented reactionary propaganda campaign to prevent anything significant or transformative from happening. And it was a series of reactionary episodes of fear-mongering, unlike anything I've ever seen. And I wanted to understand it. So I started archiving news stories and analyzed them, looking for patterns. I interviewed hundreds of journalists and editors and news producers and directly impacted people in jails across the country and scholars in economics and political science and history and econometrics and criminology, really just trying to understand what are the ways in which the system is functioning and how is that different from how people are told about how it's functioning. As I tried to make it funny and accessible and interesting for ordinary people to read, because there's a lot of scholarship about this that's really boring and hard to access. I wanted it to be something that could be taught in high schools and colleges and law schools and accessible to just ordinary people that deserve to understand better the propaganda apparatus that's being arrayed against them.
Yeah, well, it's definitely very accessible and it is very funny. And I laughed out loud several times. So let's talk about Copaganda. I think we might instinctively understand that Copaganda must be propaganda for cops, but it's more than that, right? It isn't just spin. What exactly is it? How do you define it?
I think of Copaganda as having really 3 main components. The first is that it narrows our conception of safety and threat. So Copaganda has us focused on a very narrow range of harms that are supposedly perpetrated by poor people, people of color, immigrants, and strangers. And so you might be bombarded with news stories about retail theft or shoplifting or armed carjacking or home invasions or something like that. But the news just almost completely ignores other far more significant harms. So for example, we don't get front page headlines every day about all the people that died from air pollution or air pollution crimes, right? Air pollution kills about 100,000 people a year, which is about 5 times all homicide combined. Or take, for example, wage theft. So we hear a lot about property crime in the news by poor people, but wage theft is $50 billion a year, according to most applicable estimates. That's about 5 times all other property crime combined in our society, according to federal data, or tax evasion, which is about $1 trillion a year, right? So we're talking about crime at a level that is inconceivable, and it's just hardly ever talked about in the news, and so we don't feel urgently about it. That's what Copaganda does. It narrows our conception of which things we're going to fear. And then the second thing that it does, it constantly wants us to think that those narrow range of harms are increasing. So if you look at the polling data every year for the last 25 years, people have thought that those crimes in our society are rising, even though in almost every single one of those years, those crimes have been going down, and we are at historic lows in all of those crimes in our society. And this is interesting because if you ask people about crime in their own neighborhood, they're much more likely to be accurate. So when people's experience is personal and direct, it's less distorted. But when they consume more news and when they're mediated through the mass media, they're actually much more likely to have a false impression that crime is going up. And then the third thing that Copaganda does, and this is probably the most important, having narrowed our conception of safety and made us constantly afraid of those things, it tells us that the solution to our fears is more and more investment in the bureaucracy of punishment. And this is the solution to every problem, including police violence itself. Police violence means, just more investment in training and weaponry and technology for the police. This is akin, as I said earlier, to something like a modern sort of flat earther theory. Because when you look at the actual data and research and empirical evidence across the world, the levels of violence in a particular society have nothing to do with the little policies and the punishment bureaucracy that the news focuses on. So like, are there 13 police officers on this patrol or 8? Or is the sentence for this crime 9 years or 6 years? Like that stuff has no effect whatsoever on levels of harm and violence in a society. And in fact, what actually determines the extent to which a society has a lot of violence and harm are big features of the society, like levels of inequality and poverty, access to housing. A huge one is access to healthcare. So one of the biggest factors in the United States in determining different levels of violence in different areas is whether they expanded Medicaid, or levels of loneliness and isolation versus levels of community. So whether there are little programs for people like art, music, theater, places for people to congregate and hang out with each other. These are the things that actually determine levels of violence in a society. And none of them are the thing that the news media focuses on when it talks about crime and violence. It's all about investing more in prisons, police, and prosecutors. And I think that's the most important and culminating factor of what Copaganda is.
It's a deliberate campaign manufacturing consent for an entire apparatus of punishment and control, as opposed to actually making life better, like investing in art or playgrounds or healthcare. So you cite so many examples of Copaganda in the book where the journalist or the academic cites conflicting statistics, if any, or uses faulty logic to make the argument for more policing, or quotes only prosecutors and mayors and police chiefs, and importantly, omits key information that would provide more context for the audience. What's your favorite example that you like to share when you are in conversation with people to show how Copaganda is constructed so that we can recognize it when we see it?
That's like asking me to choose among my favorite children or something like that.
Something like that. What's the one that comes to mind first?
I have hundreds of examples in the book, and I think different examples illustrate different components of the Copaganda ecosystem. But in terms of how Copaganda is constructed, I think sources are a really important way to sort of understand this issue. I think one of the most important examples from the last few years is the great retail theft panic. I don't know if you remember a few years ago, there was a viral video, tens of millions of people saw this one example of shoplifting in San Francisco, Walgreens, I think it was. Some person was daring escape on their bicycle as they balanced all the stuff they had thrown in the bag, That one shoplifting in the 28 days after it happened spawned 309 news stories across the country. And this is really, really important to understand how this happened, right? And many of those news stories, as I analyze in the book, had very similar words and turns of phrase and language and sources, right? People quoted, experts, etc. And that is a hint for you that underneath every story you see in the news, there is a world bustling below it. And you have to ask your questions like, who brought this story? Why is this news now? Who benefits from this story being told? Who benefits from the language that's being used in it and the way it's framed and what context is provided versus what context is left out. And also who is harmed by the context that is either included or left out. These stories, a lot of them had similar sourcing. People from the retail industry and police associations, et cetera, et cetera. At the same time, there were no national news stories about the wage theft allegations against Walgreens, for example, which were far more significant and serious, right? So the context within which people were experiencing these stories was that there was a barrage of stories that talked about retail theft. And one of the most amazing omissions from all of these stories was the fact that retail theft in our society was not going up. And in fact, there was an early effort among the industry to actually falsely portray retail theft as increasing. They later admitted, and there was some great investigative journalism that showed that it wasn't going up, but the damage had been done. Hundreds of millions of dollars were then allocated, by Gavin Newsom and Pritzker in Illinois and Hochul in New York, all these governors and prosecutors, and laws were changed and passed in California to dramatically increase punishment and resources for prosecution and policing for shoplifting. All of it was premised on a lie. And I think this example is really good because this idea of what context you include and what context you don't is something I call in the book the selective curation of anecdote. So imagine if you asked me to mentor a young kid who was a basketball player who has never really watched the NBA, is just learning how to play and trying to join their middle school or high school team or something like that. And so I showed them a video of Michael Jordan, but I make a video of every missed shot in Michael Jordan's career. It's like 9 hours long. It's just Jordan missing shot after shot after shot after shot.
9 hours.
9 hours long, This kid might conclude this is not a good basketball player and might think, well, how did this person even make the NBA, right? And what I've done is I've used true anecdotes like that shoplifting from Walgreens, but I've stripped away a lot of the context within which somebody can understand that anecdote in order to create a false impression that this is not a good basketball player. That's what the news media did with the retail theft epidemic. It stripped away all of the other context, like what other crimes are being committed? Is retail theft even up?
Right.
How do I understand this problem? That's what the news media does with crime committed by mostly poor people and strangers and immigrants and people of color in general. It strips away a lot of the context and unmoors people from any semblance of reality to create the false impression of who is most to fear and when and how those crimes are rising and what we can do about it.
We'll be back with Alec in just a moment, so stick around. You won't want to miss this episode's Civic Spark. One small step we can all take to be more empowered and ignite collective change. But first, it's hard to believe it's been 8 years since I started Future Hindsight. I think it's safe to say we have found our groove. But I have to tell you, the early days weren't so easy. It felt like I had to figure it all out on my own. Whether that was coordinating my guests, recording the episodes, editing the audio, and don't even get me started on the social media. Anytime you're starting something new, every day seems to introduce another question that needs an answer. And that can be an overwhelming feeling. It's like your to-do list just grows and grows with new tasks, and that list can pretty easily take over your life. In those moments, what you need to find is the right tool that not only helps you out, but simplifies everything, because that can be such a game changer. Well, I have news. For millions of businesses out there, that tool is Shopify. Shopify is the commerce platform behind millions of businesses around the world and 10% of all e-commerce in the United States. 10%. From household names like Death Wish Coffee and Magic Spoon to fresh new brands that are just getting started. So, if you want to get started, you can. Take the first step with your own design studio. With hundreds of ready-to-use templates, Shopify helps you build a beautiful online store to match your brand style. And if you want to accelerate your content creation, Shopify is packed with helpful AI tools that write product descriptions, page headlines, and even enhance your product photography if that's your thing. With all these great tools at your fingertips, you can get the word out as if you have an entire marketing team behind you. In just a few minutes, you can easily create email and social media campaigns wherever your customers are scrolling or strolling. It's so great to know that Shopify is your commerce expert with world-class expertise in everything from managing inventory to international shipping to processing returns and beyond. If you're ready to sell, you're ready for Shopify. You know what I love about Shopify is that no matter how big you want to grow, Shopify gives you everything you need to take control and take your business to the next level. Turn your big business idea into cha-ching with Shopify on your side. Sign up for your $1 per month trial period and start selling today at shopify.com/hopeful. Go to shopify.com/hopeful. Shopify.com/hopeful. And now let's return to my conversation with Alec Karakatsanis. You just mentioned that really one of the mainstays of Copaganda is that crime is rising. The media is constantly telling us that there's a crime wave across the country. But I'm curious about what the actual numbers are when it comes to crime statistics. You just said that actually we have a low crime rate, but I think that's totally missed. So what are the numbers and how can people make sense of what's actually happening around us?
In the book, I have all of the data that the police and the FBI and the federal government themselves collect. And the data is unambiguous, no matter how you cut it. Now, of course, there's lots of flaws in the very enterprise of these policing institutions collecting crime data. They only focus on certain kinds of crime committed by certain kinds of people. They don't even really report a lot of crime, like environmental crime or white-collar crime, because this is a key fact about our society that you absolutely have to understand. We only know about the crimes where we look for them. So where the government allocates resources to investigating crime determines where the government is going to find and record and prosecute crime. So when the government makes a decision, let's say, to dramatically reduce the number of IRS agents or environmental prosecutors or increase the number of drug enforcement agents or border patrol agents, etc., it dramatically changes who they're looking for and for what conduct. So this is famously the case, for every year of the last several decades, there's been hundreds of thousands of untested rape kits in police departments across the country. Police in America just made the decision essentially to not care about many, many sexual assaults and instead to focus on nonviolent drug cases for a lot of reasons. Those cases are much more profitable and it's simple for the police, and the people that they target in those cases are a different demographic, et cetera, et cetera. But even among those drug cases, they are not sending undercover SWAT teams to dorm rooms at Yale University. They're sending them to poor black neighborhoods down the street in New Haven, Connecticut. Police are not arresting kids for fights at wealthy private schools. They're arresting kids for fights at public schools where a lot of poor children go to school. So these are discretionary choices that are made across the policing bureaucracy. So you have to understand that with the crime statistics I'm about to talk about, they are already distorted, right? Because they represent the deliberate choices of the punishment bureaucracy and people in power in our society about which crimes we're even going to look for and which crimes we're not going to record at all. In terms of the crime data, the FBI and the police mostly track and report what they call index crimes, which are some of the most major crimes, right? And the things that you're used to seeing, robbery and sexual assault and certain types of theft, murder. These crimes are near historic lows, and they have been for the entire period of the post-2020 uprisings, way below what they were 30, 40 years ago, and trending downward. Now, maybe there are tiny little blips month by month here or there, or by a couple percentage points in a given year, but like the general trend is extremely downward and steady. And this is not just a US phenomenon. This is happening, in many places around the world. It's happening all across the country. So that's the reality of the situation. And if you consumed mainstream news post-2020, you were told a very, very different story based on short-term blips that were related mostly to the pandemic, but that aren't representative of sort of broader trends and have absolutely nothing to do with punishment policy. They have to do with bigger features of our society.
Yeah, that makes sense. So Future Hindsight is a democracy show, and I want to pivot here to the philosophical goals of Copaganda, because of course we all know that, based on this conversation, but from real life experience, that the actions, for example, of the LAPD during the anti-ICE protests in June are a product of decades worth of Copaganda. What kind of political philosophy does Copaganda advance, and why is it so dangerous?
This is going to sound potentially alarmist to people, but you have to understand the history of the punishment bureaucracy to understand its philosophy and its goals. It is an authoritarian institution. In any given society, not just the United States, the security forces, the punishment bureaucracy, they serve the interests of people who have power in that society. So in a society where there's a dictatorship or something, people readily understand what the role of the police is. In a society that's more of an oligarchy, where smaller groups of people wield a lot of power and influence, the punishment bureaucracy serves their interests. Then there's another layer to this all, by the way, which is that there is a growing and frightening sort of global authoritarian movement that is supported by the multi-billion dollar intelligence and military industries. So a lot of the same policies and surveillance technology and artificial intelligence technology and policing practices and big data databases, whether it's cameras or license plate readers or digital ID systems, these are being promoted and built by a relatively small group of the same for-profit companies. So there's this global undercurrent of surveillance and control that is grafted onto these traditional nation-state punishment bureaucracies in a way that makes the developments across all of these countries extraordinarily linked. And a lot of the multi-billion dollar industries are owned by similar interests, right? And they sell these policies to their populations in different ways. So one of the most important points in the book is that much of this stuff in the United States is sold to a liberal population that thinks of itself as valuing democracy. It's sold as kind of like reforms, right? Like the police body camera, which the multi-billion dollar industry desperately wanted for years, which is, I think, the greatest achievement of modern propaganda, selling that to U.S. liberals in order to get liberal local governments and the federal government billions of dollars that they then spent on what in other countries was explicitly understood to be a sort of authoritarian, total surveillance, holy grail.
Right.
But I think the general point is at every single moment in U.S. history, the punishment bureaucracy has mobilized to serve the interests of people who have power, and it has attempted to crush every major social movement that sought greater equality or progressive change in some way. So obviously the origin of modern policing was in slave patrol and militias, and in much of the rest of the country in gangs that would target striking laborers, right, and immigrant workers. But it evolved, especially after World War II, it began using this propagandistic framing more about public safety, and as opposed to being about preserving inequality. But if you look at anti-slavery movements, if you look at women's suffrage, if you look at anti-war movements, if you look at the civil rights movement and the modern environmental movement, on and on and on and on and on, at every single movement, the full force of the punishment bureaucracy was arrayed against and tried to crush these movements. If you look at the civil rights movement, take Chicago alone, had 500 police officers working undercover to infiltrate and sabotage the civil rights movement in Chicago. And that was going on all over the country. We don't even know the full extent of it. Some scholars estimate there's hundreds of thousands of police officers and way more informants who were working at the behest of J. Edgar Hoover and the FBI and local and state and federal police agencies across the country to crush the civil rights movement. And this is happening to this day. And that's what you're seeing in Los Angeles, right? You're seeing a wide range of mythologies and traditional role of police and the attempt to, I think it's kind of ham-handed and very transparent, especially when you see Trump, deploying the military, and they're not even trying to hide it. Maybe the Democrats in LA government try to sort of hide the nature of what the LAPD is doing, but it's a lot harder for Trump because people understand and see him as more of an authoritarian figure. But make no mistake, these institutions are authoritarian institutions, and they always have been.
Right. So one of the things that you write about is how Copaganda obscures how politics and power work. And so if you're growing up today, as opposed to, let's say, in the 50s, 40s, 60s, a lot of readers really don't understand why things happened. And you argue that Copaganda depoliticizes us, which is to say, and I'm going to quote you here, that, quote, Copaganda distracts people from the material conditions of our society that both produce and ameliorate crime, end quote. Tell us more how Copaganda transforms all of us into passive consumers of fear rather than active democratic participants.
One of the most important things to understand is if you don't have a good sense of how power works, if you don't have a good sense of how or why policies come to be, you won't have a good sense of how to change them. And the news media does an incredible job deceiving people about how policies come to be, especially punishment policies. So, for example, you might read in the news, Governor Hochul vetoes bail reform, right? The news kind of, in a very simplistic way, portrays all policy as the product of deliberate debate and rational thinking. Like, these are the arguments for this thing and those are the arguments for that thing. And so, the better policy will win, something like that. Or the policies are the result of the intentions and the personalities of the people in power and not this longer causal chain. And this is, I think, one of the most important chapters in the book, which I call the big deception. How the news media simplifies and distorts our understanding of how change happens and how power works so that it gets people, particularly liberal people, right? Because my book is really focused on people who I think are well-intentioned, liberal-minded, people who want a society with more equality and less violence and more human flourishing and autonomy, et cetera. So I'm not gearing this book toward the far right. But one of the most important components of democratic participation is actually understanding how things work. So the issue that I've worked on for most of my career in the last decade has been the money bail system in the United States. So there's hundreds of thousands of people jailed on any given night in this country, separated from their kids, solely because their families lack small amounts of cash. Okay? This is a horrific injustice. It's devastating. It actually increases crime. It is one of the most scandalous features of our legal system. And we've been winning these cases across the country, striking down these systems. Now, if the money bail system worked like the news makes it sound, I could just walk up to the local judges or the mayor and the chief of police and the DA and the governor, right, or Congress, and I could say, hey, you know what? Let's look at all the empirical evidence here. And I could show it to them, and they would say, oh my goodness, you're right. This is a really ineffective policy. We're so sorry. We're going to not do that anymore. Right? It's like, I'm being crude and simplistic, but that's kind of the narrative that is spun for people.
Right.
And that makes people passive. And it also tricks people into the kinds of things that they do to make change are not effective because they're not actually focused on confronting power or why things are happening in our society. So in the context of the money bail system, for example, the money bail system does not exist because anybody thinks that it's actually better for safety. That is just completely untrue. I mean, if you actually said that to police officers and prosecutors and judges, they would laugh at you. Everybody knows that
it's for the money.
Yeah, well, it's for a lot of reasons. I think, one, there's a multi-billion-dollar industry, but this is more important. The United States punishment bureaucracy is trying to arrest, depending on how you count, 10 or 11 million people every year. No society in the recorded history of the modern world has ever tried to take so many people from their schools and jobs and families and homes, churches every single year and process them through a government-run system of courts and jail cells and cages, et cetera. And this system would entirely break if the rights in the Bill of Rights were being followed. So the Bill of Rights in the U.S. Constitution was never conceived for a society of mass incarceration. Every one of those people is supposed to be entitled to a zealous defense and investigating their case and a lawyer to represent them and motions and hearings and a jury trial, right? But why do you think between 95 and 98% of all people's convictions are the result of guilty pleas? And why do you think so many cases are dismissed? Well, the system would completely break if people insisted on their right to a jury trial. We just couldn't have hundreds of millions of people participating in juries every year, right? It would break our society. So we're arresting so many people that it's impossible to follow our right. And so that's what money bail system is actually doing. If you put someone in a jail cell, they're much more likely to plead guilty because they're so desperate that they plead guilty right away to get out. So if you take our case in Houston, for example, 20,000 people before we sued them were jailed every single year because they couldn't pay a few $100s in misdemeanor cases. And they were pleading guilty and getting released in a median of 3.2 days. So they were being brought to jail, they were being brought to court, and they were being told, hey, you can plead guilty and promise to pay us some money and go on probation, which is another whole issue, fund our system for us, and we'll let you out. We'll let you back to your job and your family and your home and your medication, etc. But if you want to fight your case, okay. And if you're poor, you're just going to be staying in jail. Maybe you'll win your case. Maybe you'll get acquitted, but you're going to have spent all this time in jail and your life is going to be ruined. So what do you think people do?
They plead guilty.
They plead guilty. And that's how the system works. That's why the money bail system exists the way that it does. And when we won that case and they were no longer able to do that, they actually started dismissing the vast majority of cases because they were not able to have all the witnesses and they couldn't prove their cases. And they had to actually choose which cases are serious enough for us to prosecute. So your understanding as a democratic participant in society of why the punishment bureaucracy looks the way that it does is going to impact what you do about it. And if you think that the punishment bureaucracy is doing the things that it does because it's pursuing some kind of safety, which is what Copaganda tells you, then you're going to be totally lost when you're trying to figure out how to change it.
Well, that's why I think a lot of people cling to this idea that we're doing serious court reform or implement other ways to hold police accountable. For example, body cams. You just debunked that myth that body cams are better and safer for people. As it turns out, of course, this is all like a sham, a euphemism, and a sleight of hand. So, for example, you mentioned this also in the book, that the George Floyd Justice in Policing Act has not actually made a difference. And what's more, there are, in fact, more killings by police per year since George Floyd. How does Copaganda obscure the way we understand, quote, reforms? Because all they're doing really is nibbling at the edges, if you could even call it that.
This is one of the areas of the book that I think will really, hopefully, blow people's minds because it's the most important counterinsurgency function of Copaganda, the way that it acts on progressives and liberals. The way that the system gets liberal-minded people, progressive people who actually want to see less police violence, the way it gets them to support the very policies that lead to more violence is incredibly important. So why is it that after all those people were in the streets in 2020 complaining about police violence in thousands of towns and cities and counties across the country, that police killed more people in 2021 than in 2020? And they killed more people in 2022 and 2021. And they killed more people in 2023 than they did in 2022. And they killed more people in 2024 than they did in 2023. And for every killing, we're talking about thousands and thousands of other forms of police brutality and violence. And we're not just talking about illegal police violence. We're also talking about all of the unnecessary and incredibly disruptive, forcible arrests that happen, that don't happen in other societies and that didn't used to happen in this country. And those are important to understand too when you're thinking about police violence. It's all of the legal police violence that's happening too. So, what do we make of why so many progressive people, the Democratic Party, leading academics, nonprofits, and a huge part of my book is sort of exposing the really silly but dangerous world of the pro-police professors and scholars, right? How do we come to support policies that have the exact opposite effect of what so many well-meaning people who care about democracy and liberty and equality believe. And I think the body camera is really the best example. This is technology that is understood in much of the rest of the world to be authoritarian and incredibly powerful tool for the police. And the police desperately wanted body cameras for years. And so much so that they raised private money from people like Steven Spielberg to outfit police with privately funded body cameras.
Wow. Steven Spielberg, that's unlikely. I mean, for me, he's an unlikely person to be funding this.
Yeah. I mean, these police foundations were desperate. But the reason that police and especially prosecutors want body cameras is that they love the idea of a mobile surveillance camera that looks away from the police officer, that the police control when it's turned on, what it records, how it's edited. And they thought this would be extremely powerful evidence in low-level cases like arresting unhoused people or drug offenses, etc. This is really strong evidence that can get people to plead guilty really fast. So it can actually speed up the punishment bureaucracy and enable this assembly line guilty plea system to work if we had video evidence. Now, everybody understood that it would almost never be used against the police for a variety of reasons. And that's true. It's used every single day across the country against poor people. It's almost never, ever, ever used against the police. Secondly, they saw it as protection from liability for the police. The police could control and videotape things, right? And they're trained, obviously. If you've ever seen these videos, they look very chaotic, which is part of the police narrative because they're affixed to the chest, and so they're always bouncing up and down. It's very hard to tell what's actually happening. And then from off the camera, the police are trained to say things like, stop resisting, stop resisting, stop resisting. So they create this sense of what's going on.
Yeah. They create a video that's like a TikTok video. They create it as opposed to capturing something in real time.
Absolutely. And the title of my separate scholarly article in the Yale Journal of Law and Liberation on body cameras, it comes from a great James Baldwin quote about how the camera is the language of our dreams because it captures the reality only of the person who's behind the camera and what they want you to see. But more importantly, and this is why the multi-billion-dollar surveillance industry really wanted it. Companies like Axon, which used to be called Taser, Microsoft, Amazon, and Axon's value went up by the billions after this, right? So they all viewed this as a huge play for big data contracts with police across the country and linking it to predictive policing software and algorithms. And now you need somebody to store all that data that's created by these hundreds of thousands of police generating all this data. You need artificial intelligence algorithms to be linked to it for facial recognition and voice recognition and transcripts. And you need people to analyze it and software coders. And then you need people to train all the cops on this. So it's this perpetual multi-billion-dollar way to get new contracts. It's not the cameras themselves, which are only a few $100s. It's all of the jobs and the profit that can be created and the surveillance that can be embedded through hundreds of thousands of police officers now carrying a mobile surveillance camera with them. And this was the holy grail. And they were unable to sell people on this vision. They couldn't get local governments to spend billions of dollars on this until Michael Brown's killing. They had this incredibly brilliant idea in the wake of the 2014 Michael Brown killing. They were like, well, what if we, instead of pitching it as a surveillance tool that the police want, what if we pitch it as a reform to liberals? And so they just shifted their marketing, and Obama proposed hundreds of millions of dollars in body cameras. All these Democratic governors started proposing it. It became one of the pillars of the Democratic Party and police professor reform movement. When it was trying to be sold as an authoritarian thing that the police wanted, like maybe in like the United Arab Emirates or Israel or India or other places where the surveillance tools didn't need to be accompanied by a reform narrative, right? It's obvious to the public that these are authoritarian tools. But in this country, even the articles that rightly told the public that body cameras in all of the meta studies that have been done, they actually don't make police less violent at all, which is obvious because they were never intended to do that. Even those articles portray the body camera as a good faith attempt to reform police. And they all erase this history pre-2014 of the actual origin of the body camera and the reason that they're being promoted around the country, which is not accountability and transparency, but they were actually being peddled to us as a surveillance tool.
Well, obviously, we need to break the cycle. So every week on Future Hindsight, I ask my guest to share a civic spark, one small step we can all take to be more empowered and ignite collective change. What's a good way to turn the insights that you've shared with us into action and to resist Copaganda?
The last chapter in the book is about resisting Copaganda. And there's so much that we can all do. And I think the most important thing is educating ourselves about how this actually works. And, to that end, I'm helping people set up reading groups, and we have free copies of the book for anyone in prison, free copies of the book for any teacher who wants to teach the book in their classes. And I'm zooming into book clubs around the country if people want to read the book together. And I also have really helpful guides in the book about what you can do with your local legislators and city council people and county council people and prosecutors and sheriffs and police chiefs. These are tools that anyone could use at any community meeting or any journalist could use in questioning them and starting to evaluate and understand how they're spending their money and what policies they're implementing and why. Also, there's so many other ways for ordinary people to get involved in their own community. I talk in the book about different ways that different people with different skills, whether you're a teacher or a nurse or a public defender, or if you're a retired person like my mom, who, when she retired, she, along with people like Fiona Apple, started doing court watch.
Oh, yeah. Court watch. So powerful.
Yeah. And they watch what's going on and then they report on it to the public. And those reports lead to news stories. They lead to civil rights lawsuits, et cetera. There's participatory defense hubs you can get involved with around the country where you can help work with people who are being charged with crimes. But the most important thing is doing it with other people, because this propaganda is so relentless. It's really hard to fortify our minds against it. And we have to build communities of people that are helping us, because the propaganda is really all around us.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's true. So last question. Looking into the future, what makes you hopeful?
I think I've been really, really excited about all the people that are coming together in this time and refusing to give in, refusing to accept not just authoritarianism, but horrific genocide and violence across the world. People who are building, even in their own small community, solidarity and camaraderie and hope and mutual aid. And there's just incredible will for people in communities across this society to create a better world. And the thing that's really hopeful is that it's actually so easy. We know what policies make life better and safer for people. It's not rocket science. It's just changing the nature of some of the priorities in our investments. And it's organizing and coming together with other people in our communities to build enough power to demand that the people in power do that. And that's our task. And what gives me hope is that that's also really fun. It's really fun to come together with other people to participate in a much more truly democratic way of organizing our society. And that's what life's all about.
Yeah, I agree. Hear, hear. Thank you so much for joining me on the podcast again. It was really a pleasure to have you back.
Thank you all.
Alec Karakatsanis is founder and executive director of Civil Rights Corps and the author of Copaganda, How Police and the Media Manipulate Our News. Remember, civic action doesn't have to be complicated. It's about small steps that spark progress, like sharing this episode with a friend. Let's recap this week's Civic Spark and fire up our collective power. Educate yourself about Copaganda, and as we've said many times before, do it in a group. Then, find ways to get involved in your community based on whatever skills you have. Maybe you can court watch like Alec's mom. But whatever you do, do it with other people. Next week on Future Hindsight, we're joined by James Fishkin. He holds the Janet M. Peck Chair in International Communication at Stanford University and is the director of the Deliberative Democracy Lab. His work focuses on deliberative polling, and his latest book is Can Deliberation Cure the Ills of Democracy?
But there's another kind of motivated reasoning in addition to the partisan or directional kind, and it's called evidence-based motivated reasoning. And it's when people are engaged together to get to the bottom of the issue and really figure it out. And it also lowers the temperature. It lowers the affective polarization and the dislike members of the two main parties have for each other.
That's next time on Future Hindsight. Now, be sure to follow us on your podcast app so you'll never miss an episode. We're your resource for all the tools you need to stay engaged. So follow Future Hindsight now, and we'll come right to you every week. And if you want to support Future Hindsight and all the work we do as an independent pro-democracy podcast, join the Civics Club on Patreon. Head to patreon.com/Future Hindsight now to join. Thanks for tuning in, and until next time, see clearly, act boldly, and spark the change you want to see. This episode was produced by Zack, Travis, and me.
This podcast is part of the Democracy Group,